Now we're getting into, the differences in discuss sensitivity. So there was much made before Trump and before COVID of discuss sensitivity differences between liberals and conservatives. And there were people saying for a long time that conservatives were more discuss sensitive. And, I think now we know the discuss sensitivity is definitely trumped, pun intended, by your political your political allegiances. So I think what David Pizarro was, I think, on some popular media. He's another discussed and discussed adjacent researcher, but he was talking about how your political affiliation only explains something like, or discuss sensitivity only explains something like 8% of the variability in political affiliation. But from just the discussed perspective, before COVID happened, we might have expected that conservatives would be the more afraid of a pathogen than liberals were. Tell me a little bit about kind of how it played out in the discussed community or the discussed research community.
Yeah, well, I have an interesting background in this, if you find debates within the discuss community to be interesting.
Of course.
But there was a lot of excitement about these findings about 15 years ago that conservatives in the US were more disgust sensitive. They were more prone to experiencing disgust toward vomit and feces and that kind of stuff than liberals, and what this might mean. And some of the explanations for this were that conservatives tend to be more in-group oriented and against outgroups. And some speculation was, and I think that you had Randy Thornhill as a guest on this podcast previously, that an idea that he was a proponent of is that outgroups are more likely to harbor pathogens that you are vulnerable to. And the logic underlying that is that there's kind of in-group specialized adaptive immunity for pathogens, that if group one lives on this side of the river, they're going to adapt to the pathogens that are endemic there. Group two is going to evolve to the pathogens endemic on the other side of the river. And so when people within group two interact with each other, they're kind of immune to the pathogens that other group two members have. But if they interact with someone from group one on the other side of the river, they don't have immunity, they get really sick, they might die or have other kinds of fitness costs. And therefore, people have evolved some degree of xenophobia based on this infectious disease threat of intergroup interactions. Since conservatives are the more anti-outgroup coalition, or if we think about this dimensionally, people higher in conservatism are more anti-outgroup. That's why they have higher discuss sensitivity, because they're just more avoidant of infectious disease, and that ideology presents barriers to intergroup interactions. I was highly skeptical of that idea and remain so, and I can explain that further if you want to follow up on it. But my colleagues and I in 2010 published a paper, basically a series of null findings on the relation between pathogen disgust and conservatism. Another researcher, David Pizarro, whom you mentioned, host of the Very Bad Wizards podcast, and his former student, Yoel Invar, host of the Two Psychologists, Four Beers podcast, published another...
all the podcasts.
Started to name drop your rivals.
Podcast.
Anyway, Yoel was actually a reviewer on my paper that was refuting some of his earlier work, but they published further work, again reporting this finding of the link between conservatism and discuss sensitivity. But in reanalyzing some of my data and Yoel's data, we found that there was a difference as a function of what discuss sensitivity scale you were using. So the Rosen scale, and you mentioned the name Olatunji earlier, it includes some items related to sexuality and just bundles them all together. Mm-hmm. Whereas the scales that we were using separate pathogen and sexual and moral items. And so it seemed like the sexual items were really, really driving this relationship between discuss sensitivity and conservatism. And in fact, there was one specific item from this study by Inbar et al. That really drove the relationship, and that was how disgusted would you be to inflate an unlubricated condom with your mouth? I know, this is another reason why I developed a scale, is a lot of these items are really goofy and just raise some questions about what exactly they're measuring.
An experience we've all had where somebody asks us to do that. It's very common.
Yeah, you can really reflect upon your response during the real world experience you've had in the past. But we can think about reasons why there might be some differences between more left-wing versus right-wing people in the US circa 2010 in that kind of item,
Ooh,
other than
condoms,
pathogen
the
avoidance.
conservatives.
Um, the unlubricated part is also
I know.
amusing to me. Yes, they don't want you to think that you were getting lubrication in your mouth.
So
But so Yoel and I, who had actually debated this in the literature, collaborated on another study, um, not an adversarial collaboration, but we reflected on these ideas together, and we suggested that, well, maybe the interesting thing isn't pathogen avoidance and conservatism, but rather sexual kind of restrictedness in conservatism. And there are a lot of other reasons why sexual restrictedness is related to conservatism in the US, apart from pathogen avoidance. And I think that you had Rob Kurzban on this podcast earlier, and he developed a lot of these ideas. But basically, they relate to the idea that conservatism, if we think very broadly in the American context, has an emphasis on a lot of policies that basically facilitate monogamous lifestyles and punish non-monogamous lifestyles, restrictions on abortion, restrictions on hormonal contraception, um, shaming people who have non-monogamous relationships, etc. And we propose that actually it might be that people who are more pathogen avoidant, that influences their orientation toward monogamy or not, since non-monogamy has a lot of infectious disease risks, not just what we think of in terms of STIs, sexually transmitted infections, but if you have sex with someone, you're getting really close to them. There's skin on skin contact. There's droplets flying everywhere in the
well, I
air.
mean,
Uh,
yeah. Sorry, sexual disgust is also a very good means to make some lifestyles seem unappealing, right? So it's that goes both ways, right?
yeah, absolutely. And that could also get into the relation between sexual disgust and morality as well. But ultimately, we found that once you control for the sexual disgust, there's no longer a relation between pathogen disgust and political ideology.